So over to you, Tom.
Okay, so what I want to do is start at a 50,000 foot level on the compliance calls. And I always look at the compliance calls uh, as very much part of a person-to-person relationship building that was needed for both us and our customer bank, respondent bank, to effectively manage the third party activity going through an account that we both had, an interest in it. In some ways, their customers were a mutual customer of ours because of the use of the account. So, very much I viewed it as a joint risk management obligation. And the more that I could meet with my counterparts at the respondent bank, the more effective that we were. I contrast that to maybe the more uh, checklist type approach where there wasn't really an attempt to build the relationships. It was more, kind of each side, building its own checklist. And there was too much lost in the translation on that. So, I very much emphasize that before you even get into the details, it's much more relationship building and getting on the same page as to solving a mutual problem than it
Absolutely.
is a series of risk checklist items.
Absolutely. Yeah, those are great points. And if I can add a bit that, unlike other calls, I think compliance calls it really test your communication skills, and your understanding of what the customer is saying, and reading in between lines. And I think that prep calls that we used to have, under your guidance, was absolutely a very helpful tool for the relationship managers and the team.
Yeah, no, I would agree with that. And I would also add this from my perspective, the compliance calls was much more important for me to be listening and playing off of kind of what I was hearing from the customer than for me to be presenting information. Because the overall goal was for us to mutually assess their customer base. And obviously because it's their customers, they know a lot more about them than I would. And so I had to be very much an active listener as they were describing their customer base and their approach. The other thing was, these discussions provided both of us, with tools and information needed to understand, customer base and expectations. So I would say from my perspective, I would much prefer to have a compliance call where, uh, while we did have, some topics we needed to cover, that I was letting the customer drive the content, and I was just simply asking for clarifying questions rather than me, basically doing something like this, which is, presenting some raw slides. Uh, so, once we got a more mature program, the compliance calls were very much who do you bank, who don't you bank, and how do you tell the difference? And that content could only come from the respondent. It couldn't really come from me.
So true. And I remember that, a very refreshing approach that you used to have, and then we also tried to learn from you was, the hypothetical questions that would come up during the meeting, and you would, you know, um, uh, give the customer a hypothetical case that what if a customer would come and do certain activities, how would you handle that? And that was a very very refreshing approach where it's these are open-ended questions and where the customers can really share their part of the story.
Yeah, it's funny that you recall that. I kind of view it just as organically coming out of the conversation. If the customer is talking, about, some of their specific customers. Um, just naturally, I'm asking clarifying questions saying, oh, well, what if you're seeing this from the customer? What if you're seeing that? So for me, it was certainly wasn't scripted. It was just simply as I was hearing them talk, I just wanted to, use those questions to clarify in my mind. The other thing is uh, a really good joint management of the risk is involves really nuanced issues. It doesn't involve mechanical rules. And so, by having those conversations, like, well, what if you see this, or what if you see that? That allows you to better explore the nuanced issues, uh, as opposed to just going in with, a mechanical list of questions. And a lot of the hypotheticals that you were talking about were, what I would call typologies of concern, or, how they're mitigating the risk. So for me, it was much more giving the respondent an opportunity to really show, number one, their understanding of their customers, which in almost all instances, particularly by the business people there, they understood their customers. I mean, that's a core competency for bankers. If it was just a backroom operations group, then maybe that's not true. But if I would have the bankers there, certainly they understood their customers. And so the hypothetical, as you're talking about, is just a way for me to get them to clarify in more real terms for me what their customers are. And in almost all instances, when they did that, it was presenting the customers as more benign than maybe some of the, I don't know, more rigid, typologies or case studies would be.
Yeah. Right. And the points that you have on the slide, purpose, timing, compliance call documentations are absolutely very, very important points, I think. Would you like to
Yeah, and
share your
I would
thoughts?
want to emphasize
Mhm.
the worst thing you could do in these kind of calls, from my perspective, was to treat it as a substitute for filling out the questionnaires.
Mm,
And I'm not sure I was ever in a situation like that, where we were just simply trying to get them to fill out the questionnaires. I mean, number one, that would have been done, well before the meeting. But number two, it's sort of disrespectful of the time of everybody, on both sides, to be doing those kind of questionnaire type thing. This is an opportunity for, us to have the nuanced discussions. And it's really, really a poor use of time to deal with the questionnaires. And along the same lines, what we found, and it didn't always happen in the first meeting or two, but after you do it, year after year, we ended up finding the right sweet spot for it. Was you had to
mm,
have the right level of people at these meetings,
yeah,
either respondent banks or correspondent banks. Uh, you didn't want them too junior. You didn't want them too senior.
right.
This wasn't a pageantry meeting where I wanted to be talking to, the chairman of the board, but I also didn't want, an analyst that wasn't familiar with the customer base. And for
Exactly.
me, the best level would be they have some role in participating in governance decisions, although they may not be the final decision maker. And then they were sufficiently in the day-to-day activity that they had some familiarity with the activity and the customers, so that they could bring real life context to it. If they were too high, and they didn't know that, then you lose the benefit of the nuanced discussions.
Such great points. Thank you so much, Tom. Those are absolutely great points. So I'll go over to the next slide.
Yeah, well, one last thing before you go to the other
Sure.
slide, and it's kind of mechanical, but I do think it dovetails with the whole thing that this is a relationship building.
Mm,
I found that we had meetings in several places. To the extent possible, I would prefer that they were face to face. This when I was doing them, that was before we had Zoom. It was before the COVID situation. So,
Right.
we didn't have that opportunity. But you know, in most cases, I would actually travel to the home country where our banks were located, so that I could have, the right level of people there, whether it's business or risk people. In some cases, our respondent banks would have a trip to the United States where they're visiting not only us, but they would be visiting maybe other US dollar providers, or maybe they would have some other reasons for being in the US, like industry events or something like that. And the other place that we would have conversations would be at industry events. And they could be several different types, but the most common one, and one that we always looked forward to, was the annual Sibos meetings.
Right.
I was very, very busy during Sibos. I would have back-to-back meetings all day, every day at Sibos. And, we would also set up, in some cases, dinners or other things with clients that we were trying to do it. And ironically, I even had meetings at Sibos with, people maybe whose accounts we closed or whatever, because, uh, you know, since you ultimately have these kind of compliance calls as relationships, it really did become, sort of a personal type thing where you would be exchanging, I was doing something earlier this week with a bunch of bankers, and they were asking me about the compliance calls. And I said, the success stories went both ways. They would go to Sibos and share success stories with me, but I was also sharing success stories that I had learned from other banks, or perhaps we had had. And so it was really kind of more an exercise in mutual storytelling, than anything else. And those stories were actually quite useful because it improved our techniques at managing the risk.
So true. Yes, and Cybers is absolutely, I think, a very important and a very useful event. Where you get to meet not only your existing customers, but potential, and also the ones that a bank exits. So
Right.
all great
I,
points.
I, I would agree. And I just add a couple of other things before we move to the next slide.
Sure.
They really do need to be genuine conversations.
Mm,
It's not a checklist. It's not filling out questionnaires or whatever. We need to be dealing with real issues, and the issues that we're talking about and the solutions have to be unique for the relationship. It's definitely not a one size fits all, which is, I guess maybe one of the reasons that you were seeing the hypotheticals is, for me, I was organically following the line of thinking of the customer, and really trying to give them opportunities to clarify. And along the same line, just like it's not a checklist, there needed to be some documentation from the meetings, but I didn't view the documentation as being for the benefit of, our regulators, our auditors, or whatever. What I really wanted the documentation to be was, high enough level that, it was actionable. Last thing I would want would be a transcript, but also not boilerplate. I wanted to,
yeah.
if I went back and said, oh, what did we talk about? I'd want to recall the key topics, but I'd also want to have some sort of record of what the action items are, so
Hmm.
that when we left the meeting, we could follow up on the action items. The last thing you wanted to do was to go to a meeting, have a great meeting or whatever, and then commit to follow up, and then not remember what the action items are. But these meetings, from my perspective, were for the benefit of the frontline line of business and risk decision makers. They were not pageantry things for 2020 hindsight oversight. And I think the perspective that you have is, who's supposed to benefit, really does drive the focus on it. And it makes it more genuine conversations rather than just, a series of, uh, exchanges of tactical information.
Right. Sure.